Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you're listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Today, my very special guest is Paul Sinclair. Paul Sinclair is a UFO researcher from the United Kingdom. He lives with his wife and family in the seaside town of Bridlington on the east coast of Yorkshire in the UK. He began his research into UFOs and other local anomalies in 2002 and created the ILF UFO website as a platform for witnesses to share their accounts and experiences. Paul is a most thorough researcher who is not content with hearsay or rumors. He studies and investigates his subjects to the minutest detail, then seeks out witnesses and documented evidence to back up his work. Those who Paul has interviewed relate local sightings far stranger than anything reported worldwide. Some are recent, some are historical, but they are all mysterious and fascinating. In 2016, Paul had his first book published, Truth Proof, The Truth That Leaves No Proof, contains accounts of UFOs and other anomalies around the East and North Yorkshire coastline. Paul has completed Truth Proof 2, Beyond the Thinking Mind, which is out now and became an Amazon bestseller. And Paul is already writing his third book, The Night People, and Truth Proof 3, The Neverlands. Paul is also a talented self-taught artist who creates huge surrealist artwork. He enjoys regular countryside walks and never leaves home without his camera. And Paul's website is truthproof.webs.com, and we'll have all of Paul's website information and his book information available on our dedicated website. So without any further ado, Paul Sinclair, welcome to the Cosmic Switchboard Show.
Thank you very much, James. It's wonderful to be here and able to share a bit of research, and just thank you for the opportunity.
Well, Paul, you were a man after my own heart. There are so many people in our field. We talked briefly prior to starting this interview about what passes for UFO research in the field. And you were thorough. You've had your own experiences, and you do not shy away from the high strangeness cases where I believe that's where most of the learning and most of the understanding can come from. For those who have an open mind and have a heightened sense of awareness, if you will. Could you tell us a bit about yourself for the benefit of our listeners, how you got into this field?
Yeah, no problem at all, James. I'm 55 years old, married, 4 girls, all grown and left home now. And I suppose this subject has been part of my life since as long as I can remember. I've had childhood experiences, what I wouldn't call them aliens because I don't know what we're dealing with ultimately, but some kind of entity or being. And obviously, when I got married and bringing the children up, your life's sort of detached from that. It's always there. Once you've seen these things, you can never unsee them. It's something that's unavoidable, but you still have to provide a roof for the children that you're bringing up and food on the table. So I was in such a position when I got to about 48, not got loads of money I might add, but I was in a position where I could pack in work. And now I devote entirely, probably, 15, 16 hours a day to the research. And it's not keyboard research, I need to stress. I mean, that plays an important part, I would imagine. But I think if you're gonna find new stories, new information, or old stories, rather than just revamping them and wording them in your own your own take on it, you've got to find new information, and that's what I do. I mean, I'm out later today, and I'm out tonight, and we're going to, just for argument's sake, here in the UK, obviously, miles away from you, James, but I'm out tonight, and I'm going to be taken to some porpoise, like small dolphin that have been found at South Beach, and I know where they are, and there's a guy who's found them because they're appearing with holes in them, obviously found dead. And these animals have been found throughout last year, and we might be able to touch on that shortly, because there's also along the cliff tops, because I'm very close to the seafront here, about 500 yards away from the North Sea, in a small fishing village town called Bridlington, and we've been having animal mutilations all throughout last year and a lot of strange things. That's going to form the basis of the third book, The Neverlands. But the research, it jumps into all sorts of things and all sorts of directions, to places I never thought I would go when I was researching the abductions and the UFO-related information. Another strange story cropped up, James, the Flixton Werewolf. And I don't know if you want to touch on that now.
Yes, please. Tell us where Flixton is.
Flixton's probably, as the crow flies, 10 to 11 miles from where I'm sat now, and about 5 miles inland from the sea. And it's a very small village in North Yorkshire. I'm in East Yorkshire, but as you see, the separation between the two, we're very close. And it's got ancient woodland, not massive expanses of woods. I've got to try and paint a little picture. We're on the wolds, and the wolds are an area of grassland and rough scrubland that are often quite hilly and suitable for grazing sheep and cattle in the lower land. But Flixton is an amazing place, and if any of the listeners wanted to Google it, I suggest you do. It's probably the most ancient inhabited place in the UK. It sits in what was known as Lake Flixton. Now it's marshland. It's called the Flixton and the Seamer and the Caton Cars. Carrs, cars meaning wetland, reeds and elder. That's what it sort of represents when you say cars. It's nothing to do with motor vehicles. And these stories have been coming out of Flixton about this strange creature for many, many years. I would probably think it's Britain's, if not, I might be stretching it, I don't know, somebody could correct me, and I don't mind if they do, one of the world's oldest werewolf accounts. It starts in about 937, which is, as you can see, we're going back a long way, when a refuge was built for travellers in Flixton to protect them from an infestation of savage beasts. Now, I could obviously just say this and without any proof to back it up, but the documented proof, as in, it doesn't say werewolves, I'll need to add that, an infestation of savage beasts, lest they be devoured. But it is documented in British history. It was built or overseen by the king, who at the time was called King Athelstan, and a knight called Acehorn, I mean, it's a fabulous name, going back all them years, nearly 1,000 years, built the refuge. And this wolves would have been prevalent on the wolds and in East Yorkshire and in the UK at the time, but the stories of the werewolf have come through. I've got obviously I can't go back to the 937 to collect stories from them, but I've gone back to a place called Binnington, which is a few miles out of Flixton, and there's a farmer there, an elderly farmer now. I spoke to him quite recently, so this one isn't covered in the book. Some of the stories I've collected and the accounts I've collected afterwards. And when he was an apprentice, if that was the word, the young farmhand, he claims that he saw this creature on the Caton Cars. Once again, we've just described what the cars are. It's the old Flixton, Lake Flixton. Now Caton is at the other side of the cars, probably. It's 1.5 miles to 2 miles long. And it was with another farmer who's passed away now called Jimmy Keith. And they claim that this creature, a huge hairy man, was on the cars. So they've never forgot it. And a lot of these farmers around that area have got the stories. That's a historical one. One of the other oldest one I can go back to is 1948. And another interesting element here, James, is that there's a lot of burial mounds. There's a lot of ancient earthworks where these things are seen, or where this creature is seen. I'm not going to try and impress upon listeners that I think this is a flesh and blood creature, and I may be wrong. I'm no expert here, but I don't think the UK has the landmass to support such a thing. Other people, as I say, might think I'm wrong, but it's been reported. Now, this guy claims that he saw this in 1948 when he was 11 years old. He's still alive today, this man, and I've spoke to him on numerous occasions. If I'll go back into his history, when I was looking into the Flixton Werewolf and sort of on foot walking around the village, what a crazy thing to ask people, but asking locals if they'd ever heard of the story, this man told me he'd never heard of it, to the point where he smiled at me and I thought he thought I was a lunatic. And I bumped into him, I don't know, this was back in 2014. I bumped into him, 6 months later, and I was speaking to him and I said, "Did you realise that Flixton used to be called Wolfland?" which is true. And he went, "Oh, right, you've got that far, have you?" I says, "Well, yeah, I have, yeah." I mean, it's quite uncanny that we've got a story of the Flixton Werewolf and we have a place in ancient times that was once called Wolfland. I said, "And did you know that the neighbouring village of Hundmanby, which is probably 2 miles away, did you know why that's called Hundmanby?" And he went, "Go on." So I said, "Hundmanby, farmstead of the Hound Man." He went, "Right, yeah." He says, "Well, I'll tell you now, I've seen it." And I sort of, my jaw dropped. I thought, wow, this is incredible. This guy's laughed at me sort of thing, or smiled at me and made me think that I was going nuts, asking questions, and suddenly he's telling me he's seen it. Now, there's a series of burial mounds on the top of Flixton and Staxton Wold. These are the highest points of land around. They're about 500 foot above sea level, and they're very close to the old RAF Staxton Wold radar base, which is still operational. Another strange coincidence that there's a lot of military installations around these areas of high strangeness, which I'm sure some of your listeners will connect with right away. But our RAF Staxton Wold is the oldest operational RAF base in the world, by the way, which are still working. But these are burial mounds. There's 5, and they're called Sharp How. It's a barrow cemetery. And this chap reckons that in 1948, or approximately, obviously young boys at 11 years old aren't going to have a diary and write it was 1948, but we've got his approximates. And he said you could play out in them days and no worry, your children, you know, mum and dads could let you stay out till late in the summer. He says, and it was a late summer evening and still light, and we were around the burial mounds of Sharp How, me and another boy. Now this chap's passed away, the other one. He says, and as we're approaching, there's a tree growing out of the side of the How. Well, James, I was up there recently and I took some photographs. So, and I actually think to myself, I wonder if this is the tree, because there is a big mature tree growing out of the side of the How. However, he said, there was an animal crouched down on its haunches, and we stopped in our tracks. So we're looking at it, and we can't understand what we're looking at, because it's a man covered in hair with a dog's head. Seriously, I mean, I can only relate the stories. I can't say this man's 100% genuine. It was so evasive to tell me nothing originally. I believe he's telling me something of substance. He said, and this thing was looking at something in its hands, and he described them as hands. He said, and its open palms, it was looking down into its open palms, which were covered in hair, and its fingers were splayed out. He says, but he says it weren't actually fear at first. We couldn't understand what we were looking at. In fact, Truth Proof 2, the first book, I've drawn a sketch of what they saw inside the book. However, he said it's just slowly lifted its head and looked at them. He says, and we just couldn't believe it. It had the head akin to an Alsatian dog. They couldn't get an estimation of its size, and it wasn't heavily muscled, but it was muscular, and because it was crouched down. But they would have said it was over 6 foot, possibly 7 foot tall, or he said, should I say? He said we just turned and ran, and we didn't. I mean, and they're in quite a remote location. It's remote today. There's nothing around it, so that got me thinking. If this was a prey animal, these young boys are running. They've suddenly become prey, but this thing never moved. Or if it did, they never saw it. They just turned and ran, and they'd carried that story. And then this chap says to me, my father knew about the Flixton Werewolf, or the stories of it. He didn't call it the Flixton Werewolf. This has come out in later times. Other people have sort of picked up on odd stories. This beast. And he said, then my grandfather knew about it. He says, and lots of people knew about it in Flixton. And he says, but let me tell you now, if you're not local to this village and this locality, not many people will know. He said, I could think of 5 people in the village that might be able to tell you about the Flixton Werewolf. And he said, because it's just not talked about. It's something that we know, but it's not talked about. So that was the old guy's sort of account. I mean, and the Barrow Cemetery, where this was Neolithic. These are 3,600-year-old burial mounds. So to step away from the Flixton Werewolf for a moment, it sort of threw me to images of the Indian burial grounds, where we've got these dog-like creatures, the skinwalkers and things like that, allegedly guarding the burial mounds. I don't know whether guarding's the right word, but lots of stories of the Flixton Werewolf seem to be associated with burial mounds. So I think we've got some kind of link there to other places in the world. But then I got another story from 1967, James, of two men from Flixton travelling home. There's a nearby fishing town called Filey, which will be, as we said, that they're about 5 miles inland, and Filey's on the coast. It's about 6 miles from me up the coast and 5 or 6 miles from Flixton. And these two chaps in 1967 had been for a night out in Filey. A few beers and, I don't know, whatever they're doing, trying to pick up girls or something, or girlfriends. And they claim that coming home on a motorbike, obviously two people on the motorbike, in 1967 on the A1039 road. Now that road, I was going to say that road features heavily, but it's got to do because it's the only road into Flixton. A lot of the sightings are on the A1039. So they're coming along on this unlit road with the dikes, because with it being Lake Flixton, there's a lot of drainage dikes running around this area. Either side of the road in 1967, and they're driving and they caught sight of something in their headlights coming out of one of the dikes. Not a deep dike, probably 4 or 5 foot deep. And what they described as they're approaching on the motorbike is a large man covered in hair. But interestingly, they said it had glowing red eyes. Now, they didn't stop the bike and turn round. It was sort of half in and half out of the dike coming out, and they just observed it and carried on going. Obviously very frightened, but they'd carried that story from the 1960s. Now, I've got another account from the 1960s where I don't have a date, and I'm trying to think of the guy's name because he didn't mind me mentioning his name. And he's a farmer, and he now lives in Binnington, ironically where the Jimmy Keith sighting was, and they call him Dave Hartley. That's right. Now, the only bit of a story connecting it to the Flixton Werewolf is he was walking along the Seamer drains, these huge land drainage ditches, because it's very marshy, this land. It's so fertile as well in the bottom for cattle and sheep and things. And it was night time, and he's walking along the drain, and he came to a gate where he has to put his hand over the top to unconnect the latch and go through. And when he claims that when he put his hand over the top, a clawed hand put its hand on his. Now, once again, these people could be making these stories up, but it's not really that exciting. It sounds quite terrifying. If that had happened to me, I don't know what I'd have done, probably had a heart attack. But that's all he's got to tell me. And he says it was a clawed hand, and it came over the top and put its hand on his. Now, and that frightened him to death. Now, he doesn't know what it was, but I know we've no creatures in the UK. The biggest predator we've got in the UK is a badger and a fox, allegedly. So what that was in the 1960s, I really don't know, James. But there's a report from the 1970s, and it's one that is not my own, but I think it's worth inclusion. It's been written about, and this is where a lot of the people who write about the Flixton Werewolf, they just include this report and do no actual groundwork or digging of their own, because all the reports before this one are what I've found. Nobody else will be able to tell you them. But in the 1970s, I haven't got the exact date, it says a huge dog-like man attacked a timber wagon on the A1039 road. Supposed to have ran out in front of this wagon and attacked it. I don't know how you attack a wagon, but that is the terminology. I think a guy called Keith Harris, I haven't got the information here, people, so if I've got the name wrong, don't blame me. Keith Harris wrote about this in the Ghost Hiker's Handbook. I'm pretty sure that might be what they call the book. I do have the book, but I've not looked at it for a long time. I bought the book second-hand just to look at this account. Now, I've spoken to people. What's interesting is there is a timber yard in Flixton, but unfortunately this is the 1970s, and most of the people who work in the timber yard don't remember any such thing. However, I have spoken to a few locals and they remember the story, but that one's a bit vague. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it's a little bit sketchy. But it's just Another story from the nearby small village of Binnington again, and we have to stress here that Flixton, Folkton, Binnington, they're all so close that if they were linked, you would probably call them a huge village. Folkton and Flixton, the only thing separating them is about 8 inches of stone on the name places when you're passing through the villages. Everything's close. And here we've got an account of a huge upright dog, biped dog, running across some fields at Binnington in daylight. And once again, it's supposed to have had red eyes, chasing cows. I've no account of it killing the cows. I've got reasonably accurate account of some cows being killed, but they were chased into a ravine by this creature. Now, it were widely talked about at the time, and I've spoke to schoolboys who are now mature men who remember this. So, we've come a long way, and we're still only in the 1970s. And in 1985, there's a story. Once again, this one is not my own. I think there's 2 that are not my own, but I just think we can't not include them. Of some schoolboys again, on the edge of Flixton and Staxton Wold, looking up into the woods. Once again, you've got fields that rise up to about 500 feet and quite dense woodland behind that. And they were looking at, for a substantial length of time, I think there was four boys, something that they couldn't work out whether it was a dog, or a cat, a big cat, which is an unusual thing to say. Its facial features. They didn't know whether it was a dog or the cat, and they'd enough time for one of these boys went to his grandma's and brought binoculars, and they still claimed they'd never seen anything like it. It was big, as big as the animals that had been described before, but they didn't know whether it was a dog or the cat. They couldn't understand what they were looking at. But if we wanted to jump, James, if you want me to stay on the Flixton Werewolf for a while.
Yeah, okay? I've got some questions that I definitely want you, because, like I said at the outset, before we came on, I would love to have you come back because you've got so much information. A couple of quick questions, and then please continue. Have there been reports of this creature eating or devouring something, or have they found carcasses of sheep, of cows that seem to have been gotten at by a big carnivore, but they can't figure out what the carnivore is?
No, that's the reason, James, that I'm leaning towards something interdimensional or something other, because, and we would have probably got to that, but I'm glad you've brought it up. I said before, I don't think we have the landmass in the UK to support a living, breathing, what would be an apex predator. And let's assume it's 7 foot tall and weighs 300 pounds or 250 pounds. I don't know what, because most accounts say it's lean and muscular. Now, I'm not seeing the evidence of sheep carcasses, cattle, any animals strewn around, and the farmers, once it started hitting their pockets, regardless of what they thought it was, people would be talking about it. To briefly jump from the Flixton Werewolf to what's been happening in Bridlington and where I live, just a few miles away, all through 2017, there's been sheep mutilations, which we might be able to touch on at some point, but I don't think they're to do with this. No, so in answer to your question, James, I've got nothing really to suggest that this thing's killed anything. We've just got reports of this strange creature, and it is big. There's some variations in the look of it. For the most part, we're talking about something that looks like a biped Alsatian, or that's the facial features. But there are some variations, like the 4 boys that claimed that they didn't know whether it was a dog or a cat, and there's another one for 2006, which is interesting. And we'd have to go about 15 to 20 miles up the coast, all the way along the coast, this as well, to a place called Harwood Dale in North Yorkshire. And this was, once again, young men on mountain bikes, not little boys. I think we're talking like in between 15 and 19 years old, and they're up at Harwood Dale, which is woodland with sort of walking paths and mountain biking areas, and they're coming down Harwood Dale. And he described the fire breaks, in the paths and everything. He said, and suddenly in daylight, they became aware of something to the left of them. He said there was bracken and about 30 foot, he says, and then a few shrubs. He says, and this thing was above them all, and we could see it from waist height. He said, but it looked like a gorilla. He said, and we're going fast. He says, and I'm shouting. I think there's the three of them. He says, I'm saying, can you see that? Can you see that? And they're sort of turning and looking, and they could all see it. And it were about 30 to 40 foot away from them. But the unusual thing is, he said, we're going up and down on these paths, and we're really moving. This thing's keeping up with us. But the unusual factor, he said, and it looked like an upright gorilla, was it didn't seem to be moving like they were moving. He says, and I know that there would be fallen trees. I know there would be uneven ground. He says it was almost as though it was on a smooth track. He says, and it weren't moving its arms. He says it were just moving. He said, we just couldn't believe it. And he said, we got to the bottom of the path, and I spoke to this guy. I've got his taped account. And once again, people, as I think a lot of listeners would appreciate, you're setting yourself up for ridicule if you're going to say these things. I don't really see point in somebody making these stories up. He says, we got to the bottom of the track where it went left or right. He says, to go right would have took us in a similar line to where this thing had just literally paced us probably for 30 to 40 seconds. He says, so we decided to go the other way, and they lost sight of it. No aggression, no thought of it pursuing them after they'd got to the bottom of that path. But an interesting sighting nevertheless, but that one throws us away from the Flixton Werewolf. But it's not the first time I've heard the stories of around this area of something like an upright gorilla. When I was researching early doors, I actually went to what's now the Spittal Inn, where the refuge was built in 937. After that had all, obviously over hundreds of years, sort of disintegrated or been modernised and sort of revamped, it became a farmhouse. And after it was a farmhouse, it became a restaurant and a public house, which it still is. It's called the Spittal Inn, because originally it was Carman Spittal, the refuge. And I went to speak to these people because I knew they had some very old deeds, some on parchment, and I wanted to see evidence of the infestation of savage beasts. And these people were kind enough to let me see the deeds and sit down. I sat down outside a lovely summer afternoon, and we sort of slowly went through their deeds. But what was interesting is the lady who owned the property, I didn't speak to her husband. They're looking straight up at Flixton and Staxton Wold, the expanse of woodland at the top with the radar base behind it. And she just said to me, I've heard that there's a Bigfoot in them woods. And I thought, well, it threw me a little bit because I'd come to talk about the accounts of the Flixton Werewolf, and she'd just said this. But I'd also been spending time in the wood myself, substantial amounts of time. In fact, to get a feel for it, I actually spent the night on the edge of the woodland, and it frightened me to death, listeners. I'm not brave. I'm not going to say that it didn't. And nothing happened, but just the knowledge that these things had been seen were enough to sort of get my adrenaline pumping. But one thing did happen in Flixton and Staxton Wold. I was in the wood on my own, well, my little dog with me, Wolfie. Now, an apt name, if anybody ever sees a picture of Wolfie, if you go onto my Facebook page, you'll see he's about as big as a rabbit. So we're up there, and there's nothing around. And at the side of me, there's, but loud. It sounded like somebody with a 2-pound lump hammer hitting something solid. I just stopped in my tracks, looking around, and one of those surreal moments when you're thinking, did I just hear that? But you know you did. There were no mistaking it. So I sort of got a voice recorder, flicked it on, and I sat on a fallen tree at the edge of it and got my flask out, and I thought, I'm going to sit, leave that running, and I'm going to just observe here for 30 minutes or so. And there was nothing else. It weren't windy. It weren't trees knocking in the wind. It was at the side of me. I know I've jumped from the accounts now, people, but on another occasion, I took one of my granddaughters, well, the eldest granddaughter with me, and we spent the day up there. And we were in the same area of woodland, the very same area where the tree knocks were. And suddenly we just entered what I could only describe as a zone of rotten eggs. It was just vile. It was sulphur. It was just such a vile, disgusting smell. And I asked Tegan, the granddaughter, blimey, what's that, Tegan? You know, and I knew there's bad smells associated with these things, and we did hover around for a while, but then we got out of it. So that's just two accounts of my own where I've not had sightings, but strange things have sort of happened in that woodland. But you know, we've gone from the gorilla man up at Harwood Dale and just briefly told you what the former owner of the Spittal Inn at Flixton thought, that there was a Bigfoot living in the woods, and apparently people had told her they'd seen these things. And jumping now to November 2013. Now, where the Spittal Inn is, the old refuge, there is a roundabout, and you can go to Seamer, or you can go to Staxton, or you can go to Binnington, and that's about where they take you. And this story is a first-hand account of a lady and her husband and two children coming home after a day's shopping trip in York, and I think they took the children to the pictures as well. York will be about 40 to 50 miles away from Flixton, and they'd gone out for the day, and they were driving back, and it was quite late at night. I haven't got the time in front of me, but I believe it was after 11 o'clock. I have written about it in the first book. This lady's coming down on the A1039 road, the opposite direction from Filey this time, and she's approaching the island, at the side of the Spittal Inn. And one more thing, I need to jump. There's a stream there as well, and I found that there's a watercourses seem to be associated with these sightings and I don't know whether they're going to call them apparitions, but these sightings. So after 11 o'clock at night, they're driving down. There's very little lighting, but there's a few street lights, or if you can call them lights, around the island. And it's a large traffic island with some mature trees in it, 50-foot trees. So, we're not talking about a little pedestrianised traffic island. There's shrubs and grass growing around it. And she said, I thought, what the hell's that? She said, and I thought it was a pony. She said, I can see it clearly. I can see its outline, and it's crouched down, sort of sloping, hyena-like, but didn't look like a hyena. I'm just trying to give listeners some kind of breakdown on what she thinks she's seeing. But it's it's as large as a pony, and it's got a long bushy tail, and it's got a face like an Alsatian. She said, and even though it was hairy, she could see it was really muscular. This is in a short sighting. She's a passenger. And she carried on going round the island towards Seamer. And she just said, stop the car. So she'd not told her husband. He stopped the car. She said, what? She says, I've just seen something. I just can't explain. She said, I've just seen a huge dog, as big as a small horse, on the island. So she made him turn the car around, and they did a full sweep of the island several times. There was nothing there. Well, that's what she swears she saw. Now, she contacted me. We've done a short, me and camera work aren't very good, people, but I've got a GoPro camera, and me and this lady walked down to the island, and she described what she was seeing. And I put it onto YouTube. I think if somebody wants to type in Paul Sinclair, UFOs, or that combination of words, I put it on there. And, because I wanted her account, she's off camera, she's at the side of me, I'm not showing her face, but she's describing what she's seen. And absolutely enthralled. I mean, she's been up into the woods with several of us since. It didn't frighten her to the point where she thought she'd seen a monster. All she saw was this huge creature, but since coming forward and saying it, her father-in-law, her husband even, and other people, all they've done is ridicule her, because that's what people open themselves up for. Which is sort of sad, really, but that's the way it is. And the accounts carry on, and I know there's lots more. I mean, in 2014, it was April 16th. I think there was a blood moon, and I don't know whether the moon has any correlation to this. I don't think for one second that there's people transforming from men to beast. I mean, once again, people, I'm happy to be proved wrong. All we're dealing with after all is opinion, one person's opinion and views. I'm doing a bit of research, and these are mine. So in April 2014, April the 16th, at a place called Danes Dyke, which is probably 5 miles from where I sit now, on the very edge of the North Sea. And Danes Dyke will be in line with Flixton, probably 10 miles away. A man coming home on a night shift. He'd been working at an industrial estate called Carnaby. And so he'd got a journey of about 4 to 5 miles back home. Early hours of the morning, after 3 o'clock, approaching Danes Dyke, which is in a big dip. It's a big earthwork, Danes Dyke, another ancient land with tons of burial mounds. He's on the main road, and his headlights caught sight of eyes, animal eyes. And he didn't say they were red. Animal eyes. And as he's driving down, he's sort of slowed down, and in the bottom of the dip at the entrance to Danes Dyke, he claims that he saw a man, and his only description, or his description of it, was it looked like the American werewolf in London. It was crouched on all fours and terrified him. This man went home apparently, and normally when he comes home, his procedure is to unpack his things, probably have a coffee or a tea and go to bed. This man woke his wife up frightened to describe this thing that he'd seen. And this is at Danes Dyke. Now, there's a lot of stories. I wouldn't call it the Flixton Werewolf because we've moved 11 miles, but I think ultimately we're dealing with something very similar, if not the same thing, from Danes Dyke. So we just touched on Bessingby, where this man was driving home from, about 4 or 5 miles away in the Carnaby Industrial Estate. And in 2014 to 2015, some security guards who contacted me, they're all ex-military. And they won't mind, I'm not going to say the names, but they won't mind me saying this if they ever listen to the show. They were overseeing, guarding some wind turbines that were being built. A lot of expensive materials were put on them, and they're on Bessingby in a place called Hasthorpe. And they've got in their logbook, I took a photograph of it, that their men claimed that they'd seen a huge dog on all fours, but once again, we're talking as big as a pony, a small horse, running across the fields. And what was interesting was, what backed it up, I haven't got this, but at the industrial estate at Bessingby, apparently they've caught this on CCTV. Now, I went to speak to these guys and spent the night with them. When this was happening, because I know we're not forced to see it again, but it seemed quite active at that time, because a man and his wife stopped the car and ran up the fields to the security men to ask them if he said, have you seen that? And they said, what? We said, well, this huge dog's just crossed the road. It's unlike any dog we've ever seen before, which was ironic because these guys at the security compound had also logged it in their notebook that they'd see, their entry book, that they'd seen it. For a few days during that time, there was an Apache helicopter flying low over the fields. That's sort of logged and noted. It's not just me that's adding it to the story. Now, it could be perfectly innocent, but it's unusual to get military helicopters flying, sweeping the fields. We're not talking hundreds of feet up. They're really low over the fields. So I'm wondering if there's any sort of connection to what had been seen. I find it quite interesting. And in the same month, a guy living not far away, I'm naming places and I realise that you guys aren't going to know them here in the UK, but they're all in very close proximity to Flixton and Bridlington, where I live. And another guy, 2 miles away at a place called Hasthorpe, says that he saw something that slinking across at the bottom of his hedges. He owns some land and he keeps sheep. Once again, no sheep were killed, but his hedges were about 4 foot tall, and he said that it looked like the back of a cat. He said, and there's nothing that big that I could imagine. He said, and it was slinking like a cat would do. He said, I was a bit too frightened. It were black, so it would take it like 4 foot tall. And it was just walking along. He saw the back of it walking along the hedges. So that were reported all along the same time. There's a farmer nearby at Langtoft who put a drone in the air looking for deer. And in one frame, and I'm dying to see this frame, James. I'm dying to see. He's got what looks like a bear. Now, I've spoken to numerous people. Only person I haven't spoken to, so this is not first hand at the moment, is the farmer. I want this bit of footage, and other farmers have seen the frame or this capture of because when he swept back or was sweeping the land, it's not there. He only caught it in one frame. So what that was, we don't know. But you know, we've got so many reports. You know, back in 2015 at Folkestone, which is literally, as I've just said previously, so close to Flixton that the two merge, and there'd still be a small village, Folkestone and Flixton. There's a guy there at Folkestone who owns a farm on the edge of the cars. So his horse has been. They felt they were all agitated at one end of the paddock, and he couldn't understand why. And he went and looked across, and he claims that there's a huge upright man running across the cars in daylight, covered in hair, about 7 foot tall. This thing, whatever it was, stopped and squatted down. He doesn't know why, just briefly, and then set off again. He said, and it went up into the woods. Now, what's interesting about this sighting is, because I've done a little bit of research on the area where it ran, and it went up into what's called the Spellhow Plantation, which is on the edge of the hillside. And what we've got in the Spellhow Plantation are burial mounds, Elfhow and Spellhow. And once again, so we've got what's called the Diamond Plantation, where people claim to have seen it. And there's nothing to do with diamonds. It's a group of trees shaped like a diamond. But there's burial mounds there. So there's so many stories, James, associated with burial mounds. And I'm looking, and I've sort of got lots and lots of reports of this thing. If you go further up the coast to a place called Sand's End, the fishermen these rock anglers fish during the winter months when the seabirds aren't nesting on the edge of the North Sea. Now, these cliffs are absolutely sheer at Bempton, Speeton, Ravenscar. I mean, they range from 200 to 400 foot, and they're on the edge of these cliffs fishing. God knows how they bring the fish up from them cliffs, but they do. But there's fishermen report seeing, with the headlights on, the Cree headlights, seeing eyes that are tall, not an animal, not low down to the ground, 6 or 7 foot in the air and widely spaced, and walking towards them. And every time they put the headlight on it, this creature, whatever it is, drops its head. And then they turn and put the headlight on it again, and it's there again, and it drops its head. And it's frightened some fishermen who I've spoken to so much to the point that they've cut their lines, gathered the rod and what they can, and ran. Nobody's been killed. There's no reports of anybody being injured. But obviously, I mean, I think if I saw this, I'd probably do the same. So we're sort of, as you can see, the area is, when you start looking into it, James, the area is quite heavily talked about with animals like the Flixton Werewolf. I paused there because something come up on my computer. Your internet connection is not good. Are we still sounding okay,
I
Jim?
can hear you fine. And I just want to make a quick comment and a couple of questions. I can't remember if it was Tacitus, the Roman historian, if it was Caesar in his commentaries, but some ancient Roman scribe from way back when, he talked about these wolf and dogman creatures running around the dense woods of Britannia, right? I have to look into that because somebody from way back when the Romans came to Britain wrote about this, right? And you kind of answered a question, because I was going to ask if all this anomalous activity had attracted any apparent military interest, right? And you kind of answered that when you mentioned the Apache. You were going to make a comment a moment ago, Paul. Please continue.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it was, because actually the computer did throw me because that message came up. So I'm sorry, listeners, if we had a bit of a pause there. But if we stay then with the ancient people and Flixton and the Lake Flixton, anybody wanting to do a little bit of research on it, it's called Star Car, Starr. And as I've said before, the cars at Reeds and Elder and Wetland. Now, Star Car is probably the oldest archaeological site in the world. And they found evidence of Britain's earliest house there, meaning people settled at Star Car earlier than anywhere that they can find any previously. And there's evidence of mass butchery, animal butchery. Obviously, people had to eat, but it looks like sacrificial butchery. And this is the archaeologists talking, not me. They believe that the inhabitants of Star Car were shaman. Now, I think that's quite interesting when we're looking at accounts of the Flixton werewolf and other animals, because they've also found that there's also writings that they think that this creature is some kind of shapeshifter. Now, they found 21 deer skull caps with eyes carved into them, and they don't think that I realise we're all saying they don't think. We can't possibly think what people were doing 11,000 years ago, because this isn't Neolithic, 3,600 like the burial mounds. This is Paleolithic. This is going back 11,000 years. So, you know, we're into a really ancient race of people. Now, they found these deer skull caps, and they believe they were used for ritualistic practices and animal butchery. And I mean, I don't know whether anybody thinks there's any truth to people transforming. As I just said earlier, I don't think there's anybody running around in cut-off pants and transforming into a wolf. But we have to sort of cater for everything and sort of look into everything. And if these people were into some kind of ancient magic and have evoked something, could the Flixton werewolf be a remnant of that time? That's basically where I'm sort of going with that, you know. And as for my own sightings, I've not seen an upright creature covered in hair, but I have had a few weird experiences. Obviously, I place myself in these locations at strange hours. Are we talking 5 and 6 in the morning? We're talking all night. So I'm better placed to have an experience, perhaps, than other people who are just sort of walking in the daytime. And these places are quite remote also, people. You've got to understand that. So they don't get lots of foot traffic. But I have had a few weird experiences. We was at Bempton, which is what a lot of the Truth Proof books centre on, a 30-mile radius of Bempton and the old RAF base. And I was with a guy called Andy Ramsden. And we'd packed up for the night and we're walking home, or walking towards the car. And I have a powerful torch and I put it onto this, just swept it across the field, and we sort of caught eyes, amber eyes, different to what we'd been seeing before, and they were quite high up, you know, higher than a rabbit or a hare, and they're widely spaced apart and quite big. And it's starting to drizzle. And I stopped and I'm looking at these eyes, and Andy's getting a bit twitchy, and he's saying, I think we better go, Paul, you know, because we'd all during the night, and just to say I'm not making this up, people, it's in Truth Proof 2, earlier in the night, an animal, which I assumed as big as a deer, had sprung up from the edge of the cliff and ran up the field in the night. It was that quick, we couldn't actually, we couldn't take it all in. I just said, Christ, Andy, what the hell's that? And it were off up the field. I don't think it were a deer because it were heavy on its feet. Andy didn't see it, Andy could hear it. So we'd seen that, or I'd seen that, and then we come across these eyes way in the distance in the field. So I dropped my box. I've got a plastic container with cameras in it and things, and I picked a Canon camera up out of the box, not equipped for shooting pictures at night. I have a good camcorder for that, but I didn't want to get it out. It was drizzling. And I put it on, didn't bother holding it to my head, and I said, I'm going to go closer. And Andy's sort of protesting. He'd tell you now if he was sat here, don't, I think we should go. And I started to walk across the field. I had to walk over a slight bank, and I'm walking across the field. Now, this thing, Andy will admit the same. We'd got torches on it. It blinked. But what was odd, we couldn't see its head. We could only see the eyes. But it was strange because I'm sure we could see land at the back of it. But the eyes were widely spaced apart, you know, as wide as a human's eyes. And it blinked, and we couldn't see it. And I said to Andy, I said, it's gone. And I looked back at Andy, he says, come on, Paul, let's go. So I put the torch on again, and it's moved a bit further back, but not in a way that an animal would do a runner. This thing's just observing again. And we slowly watched it lower to the floor, and whatever it was then was at the grass height. It was as though it had laid down in grass. And I'm probably halfway across this field then, and Andy's sort of protesting, and I thought to myself, well, yeah, it's almost as though I'm getting lowered out into the field. So I turned and I went back, and I got some pretty crap pictures, if I'm being honest, listeners, because I was sort of taking pictures and holding this camera at my waist as I'm going. And I've got pictures, I've got the eyes, and as you can appreciate, the camera weren't equipped for it, and we've got motion blur. And, you see some UFO reporters say they've got this object moving and you see yellow zigzaggy lines, and what they've actually got is motion blur. They probably just took a picture of a satellite. I'm sorry, I'm going off on one now. But, so yeah, we got these eyes. So I went back and we sort of discussed what we'd seen. Now that throws me in to the Bempton area and what was happening in 2017 around Bempton that we weren't aware of, the mass sheep killings that were happening at Bempton. Now, once again, we've said, has it killed anything? Whatever were killing the sheep at Bempton wasn't eating them. It were just removing the throats. I've got all the photographs still. I have a lot of photographs of these animals. But that's for another part of the story, I think, James, because, if we're staying with the Flixton Werewolf, these stories, they're around this area, and they've come out of this area. Whitby's just up the coast, and Ravenscar, and they've got folklore stories of a huge black dog with red eyes that they call the Barguest. I mean, these are old stories. In a place called Goathland, further up the coast from Whitby, but all on this coastline, they've got stories of a huge dog that's described as half horse, half dog, and they call it the Guy Trash. And there's a lot of connotations, and in Staffordshire, which we're going out of the area, they have a dog called a huge black dog, similar to what we're describing as the Flixton Werewolf, called the Padfoot. And in Norfolk, in the 1400s, and up to present day, they report seeing a huge black dog, and they call it the Black Shuck. We're all sort of place names and different takes on it, but these stories come from all over the world, and if you stayed with the shapeshifters, and I don't know if it's somewhere that I sort of lean towards, but I think we've got to talk about it. In Sierra Leone, they were the leopard men of Sierra Leone. I don't know if you'd ever heard of them, James. And you'd got documented accounts of these people practicing ritualistic magic and thinking that it could transform into leopards.
Yes.
And these stories, I think there's an ancient book. Well, I know there's an ancient book. I'm just trying to think of its name. The Restitution of Decayed Intelligence. What a fabulous title. I wish I had thought. Oh, jeez, yeah. Yeah, well, that speaks of the werewolf. If anybody can find a copy of it on internet or anything, and there's a lot of stuff about the werewolf and ritualistic magic and how to transform in there. I'm not trying to impress upon listeners that I'm leaning towards that, but I find it quite interesting that the magical aspect of the transformation is similar in all cultures of the world, meaning you've got to do something very dark, very bad to enter this sphere of magic, this sphere of darkness. And I find it interesting that, as I say, these things are sort of all over the world, and in ancient times, how would people have known? And you touched upon the Romans earlier. Well, and when you look at Egyptian times, and you've got Anubis, which was some kind of guardian to the underworld, and you've got the skinwalkers, which are sort of said to oversee the burial mounds or guard the burial mounds. You've got things like the Flixton Werewolf stories, which are seen around burial mounds. There's a connection. There's a bit of a pattern forming, James, Yes,
and the fact that the UK has an abundance of high energy ley lines, dragon lines, vortex areas in a relatively small place. I mean, end to end, England and the UK in general is quite large, but the profusion of ley lines there, it's a highly energized place. And I was going to ask you also, but you kind of touched on it already. Have there been accounts which suggest that this creature, this dog wolf creature, has any kind of metaphysical attributes? Like, for example, were there times when it did not leave prints in places where it should have left prints? Were there are times when they tracked prints and then they abruptly disappeared? Or you mentioned earlier one of the creatures was described as kind of just sliding along, after the bicyclist. So has anyone ascribed any metaphysical attributes to these dog creatures.
Do you know something? I've not had anybody tell me that they've found prints. And what you just said about the young guys at Howard Dale and this what they described as looking like an upright gorilla, and they said it would have been huge. They're talking 9 foot tall, I think. They said it was huge, and they said it would just got like going on a track, as though he said we know that there must have been dips in the land, fallen trees, and everything, and this thing stayed on a level course and paced us as we're going down that hill to the bottom of Howard Dale, and then we I think they took a right and sort of lost that thing. So no. And I had a strange experience in Danes Dyke, which made me sort of hair stand on. And late last year, me, my wife, and the little dog, we went for a walk to Danes Dyke. And we were at daytime, and we're in this area of woodland, which I've called Dark Wood in the book, because there's a few things happened in this particular bit of wood, strange accounts and different stories from other people. And I'm in there. I've always got a camera with me. So, and I think Mary had got a Canon camera. I'd got a Nikon P900. Not that that's any relevance. So I put the camera on. Mary's about 10, 20 feet away from me. Wintertime, no leaves on the trees. Everything's pretty sparse. And I lifted the camera to take a picture. Now, I'm intrigued by this, so if anybody can help me, please do. And as I did so, something pulled me backwards. And I swear on my children's lives, I moved backwards. And it was one of them surreal moments. It was my right shoulder, and something seemed to touch it, and I went backwards. I'll tell you the feeling in a minute, because other listeners might relate to this. And I sort of looked round. I looked at the dog, which we've already described as big as a rabbit. He's not going to do it. My wife's 10 to 20 foot away, and I looked. No trees snagged me. I thought, wow, did that really happen? It did. Wow, that was incredible. So I thought about it for a few minutes as I'm walking down the path, and then that had left me. We were talking, and I lifted the camera, and it happened again. So there's no mistaking it. I was pulled backwards. Now, my immediate thought was, and I don't know why I thought it, I thought, is this how the people are disappearing? I don't know why I thought that, but now I would need to tell listeners what the feeling felt like, because it was not like somebody grabbing you on the right shoulder and pulling you. If you get two magnets and you put them together and they don't want to touch, you know that sensation, that invisible push? You know what I'm talking about, James. I'm sure yes. Everybody does. It was that. Don't ask me how it pulled me backwards, but it was magnetic. Whatever pulled me was magnetic. Now, I thought long and hard, because I want to try and give listeners, because we don't have the vocabulary to describe half of the things that are happening. I don't think anybody does. That's why we can't describe UFOs in any other terms than how we're seeing them, because our vocabulary is limited. We're looking at things that aren't in our sphere of existence. They're not in our sphere of knowledge. And this feeling, all I can do is relate it as close as I can. At first I thought, did it feel like this, you know, the dampers or the hydraulic things when you lift the back of a car, and yes. That feeling. I thought, and I was saying that for a while because I knew it was just an unusual feeling, but no, the closest I can get it to is two magnets. So if anybody has experienced that in a Bigfoot, dogman, or any surreal situation, I'd love to hear from you, because that's a first for me. And why that came into my head instantly, because I just felt like I was being pulled somewhere. It was so strange. So that's all I can touch on that, James. And, you know, there's not much more that I can tell you. Them's the accounts we've got of the Flixton Werewolf.
Well, I mean, I've learned quite a lot just from what you said. And, you know, a point of interest, the Native Americans talk about some of these creatures, what are referred to nowadays as cryptids in general, including these dogmen, wolf-type creatures that seem to at times be upright and walk and run upright. The Native Americans feel that a lot of them are interdimensional, that they ingress and egress in and out of our world. They know where the doorways are. And for whatever reason, there are times when they are on this side of the veil, and sometimes when they abruptly disappear, it's simply because they went back to their native world, if you will. So yeah. There's this interdimensional metaphysical aspect that needs to be explored. And
I would entirely agree. entirely.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and just to stay on that for a moment, I spoke at length on numerous occasions to an American Indian called Larry Sespooch. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
He's worth Googling. He's got knowledge on the skinwalker, and he's done YouTube videos. He's an elder, and he sort of teaches children and talks about the old customs. And I sought him out because he were talking about the skinwalkers. I mean, he don't talk in fanciful terms. He talks from ancient knowledge that and he was of the opinion, after I told him about what we're being seen at Flixton, that what we're dealing with is what they would term a skinwalker. And he said to me, he said, this thing has the ability to live in two worlds, just like what you've said. He said, and when it's in our sphere of existence, it has to breathe, it has to eat, it could be killed. He says, but its attribute, its skill, I don't know whether it's its skill or its inherited trait, is that it's a creature that lives between two worlds. And I lean towards the interdimensional type entity here. And I know there's a lot of people, I spoke on Vic Cundiff's Dogman radio, and I know there's a lot of people believe that these dogmen are a flesh and blood living creature. But I think to myself, when I'm listening to these guys talking, and no disrespect to them, but the seasoned hunters, we don't hunt in Great Britain like they do in America. And they talk about guns, 30-yard sixes, and they talk about various caliber guns, and they shoot. They say that this is a living, breathing creature, and they shoot it centre mass, and it has no effect on it. So, to me, you're contradicting yourself when you're saying it.
Yes.
Because,
yes.
You know, and that's not. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, because these guys know about hunting and everything. But if we've got a creature that weighs 300 pounds, 400 pounds, and you know your gun could normally drop that to its knees, and they shoot it and it just runs off, and they hit it, they know they've hit it, as they say, centre mass. And I've heard this numerous times. We're not dealing with anything that's a normal flesh and blood eating animal. We're not dealing with a normal carnivore. If this thing's huge beast that's tapping on people's windows in cabins and trying door handles, it's almost as though it's some entity that's just trying to instill fear. I mean, maybe they live off fear. Maybe it's, I don't know. I don't mean live, but maybe there's some kind of element that the fear that they instill, they get some kind of vibe from it. I really don't know. I mean, all I'm doing is collecting stories and relating them with an open mind, and I try not to form too many conclusions, but I do genuinely believe that here in the UK we don't have the landmass to support what would be an apex predator.
Well, we've reached the end of the fascinating first segment with Paul Sinclair. Paul, do you want to tell the listeners about the books that you've already published, as well as the book that you're going to publish, and your website and the means with which people can order your books?
Yes, certainly. The books are available on Amazon, and and on a PayPal site on the Truth Proof website, which is truthproof.webs.com. I have a Facebook page, so I'm quite happy to talk to anybody. I treat everybody with the same respect that they treat me. So if you add Paul Sinclair on Facebook, or there's a Truth Proof page on Facebook where you could buy the books as well. So there's Truth Proof 1, which is the truth that leaves no proof, and Truth Proof 2, Beyond the Thinking Mind. The third book would have been out this year, and that was about alien abductions and my own experiences from childhood to now. However, things have started happening close to where I live at Bempton throughout last year, and I've stopped writing it 3/4 of the way in and started another Truth Proof. I just have to document this information as it's happening. It's quite incredible. And I've spoke about it a few times. It's the stuff unfolding here that's just amazing. So yeah, that's where we are with the books, James. And anybody who wants to speak to me, you can email me at paulsinclair.ilf@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your stories. I treat everybody with respect, and I give everybody the discretion unless they want the names included in the book, if the story wanted including.
And Paul's website is truthproof.webs.com. And like I said, we're just getting started, and I'm going to ask Paul about some of the experiences he's had coming up to the present time, as well as a lot of other information he's going to share about other things that are going on in his neck of the woods. What I like to do with the Cosmic Switchboard is I like to find experts in a given locale in a certain part of the world that is a known hotspot. And some of these are well known, Sedona, Arizona. Some of these places, at least from an American or European standpoint, may not be as well known, but they need to be well known. So we're just getting started. For our listeners out there, if you like what we do, if you believe in what we do, please go to thecosmicswitchboard.com, sign up and become a member, and we'll see you at the top of the next segment.